Wealth and power can't hide everything. Today we're diving into 3 shocking high society crimes, scandals, deception, and justice pushed to its limits. Let's begin. They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. But for Barbara Cogan, scorned wasn't enough. She wanted revenge served with a hefty life insurance payout. On a crisp October morning in 1990, her wealthy husband George lay dying on an Upper East Side sidewalk, groceries scattered around him, while Barbara sat in a salon chair getting her hair done for $500. The price of the hit? A cool $100,000. The payout? $4.3 million in life insurance money. But this isn't just another story about greed and murder. This is about a woman so patient, so calculating, that she managed to evade justice for nearly 2 decades while living off her dead husband's money. They called her the Black Widow, not just for the designer funeral attire she wore to court, but for the way she slowly, methodically, spun her web of deception. So who was Barbara Cogan, and how did this Barnard College graduate and former recording artist transform into one of New York's most notorious Black Widows? Well, before we dive into the dark turn her life would take, let's start at the beginning. Barbara Siegel seemed to have it all: beauty, brains, and talent. Growing up in the cozy suburbs of Morristown, New Jersey, she showed promise early on as a singer, even landing a recording contract with Capitol Records at just 16 years old. Though her music career didn't last, her future looked bright when she enrolled at prestigious Barnard College in New York City. It was 1960 when Barbara, still a student, met George Cogan. George came from money. His family owned successful department stores in Puerto Rico, and he was studying business at New York University. The attraction was instant. Here was a young man who could provide the lifestyle Barbara dreamed of, and in Barbara, George saw a sophisticated beauty who could help him climb the social ladder. They married after college, and George whisked his new bride away to Puerto Rico, where they spent the next 25 years building what looked like a perfect life. They had 2 sons, and George's business acumen helped them amass considerable wealth through real estate and the casino industry. By all accounts, they were living the high life in tropical paradise. But paradise, as it often does, had an expiration date. In 1986, with their sons grown, the Cogans decided to return to Manhattan. They sold their interest in the Ramada San Juan Hotel and Casino, ready to start a new chapter. They bought a luxurious Fifth Avenue apartment and opened an antiques store, Cogan & Company, catering to New York's elite. It should have been the beginning of their golden years together. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The trouble started when their antiques business hit some rough patches. After a high-profile robbery where singer Lena Horne was browsing the displays, the Cogans hired a public relations firm to help manage their image. Enter Mary Louise Hawkins, a beautiful blonde publicist 20 years younger than George. Mary Louise was everything Barbara wasn't: young, fresh, and attentive to George's needs. While Barbara had grown comfortable in their wealth, perhaps even complacent, Mary Louise reminded George what it felt like to be truly desired. The attraction was immediate and intense. By 1990, George had left Barbara for Mary Louise, and the divorce proceedings were getting ugly. Really ugly. Barbara, accustomed to a life of luxury, demanded $5,000 per week in alimony. When the judge denied her request, something in Barbara snapped. She wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing her lifestyle, her social status, and her security. But Barbara Cogan wasn't going down without a fight. Enter Manuel Martinez, a lawyer with a shady past and connections that would prove deadly. While representing Barbara in the divorce, Martinez offered something else: a permanent solution to her George problem. As autumn settled over New York City in 1990, George Cogan had no idea he was living his final days. He'd moved in with Mary Louise, and despite the bitter divorce proceedings, he was happier than he'd been in years. But on the morning of October 23rd, his world, and Mary Louise's, would be shattered forever. It started like any other morning. George went out to pick up groceries, planning to surprise Mary Louise with breakfast. As he approached her Upper East Side apartment building, a man in a bright green baseball cap and plaid shirt approached. Without warning, Three .44 caliber slugs tore through George's back. The shooter calmly tucked his weapon into his waistband and walked away, leaving George bleeding out on the sidewalk, groceries scattered around him. Mary Louise, hearing the commotion, rushed outside to find her lover dying. She stayed by his side as he was rushed to New York Hospital. For 6 agonizing hours, George clung to life. And Barbara? While her husband of nearly 30 years lay dying, she was at a salon, getting her hair done for $500. The brutality of the murder shocked even hardened New York detectives. But what would shock them even more was how long it would take to bring the perpetrators to justice. Because while the trigger man might have pulled the trigger, the real Black Widow was just beginning to spin her web. In the immediate aftermath of George's murder, investigators had their suspicions. After all, the math wasn't hard to do. Barbara stood to collect $4.3 million in life insurance money. And just 1 week before the shooting, she had called the insurance company to confirm she was still the sole beneficiary. But suspicion isn't the same as evidence, and Barbara Cogan was nothing if not careful. When questioned about her whereabouts during the murder, Barbara had an ironclad alibi. She was at the salon, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses. When asked about potential enemies her husband might have had, she deflected masterfully. In an exclusive interview with the New York Post in 1990, she suggested her husband might have been killed by an irate business partner. "He had a lot of dealings with a lot of people," she said with practiced nonchalance. When asked about Mary Louise, she added, "I have no animosity for Mary Louise." The words dripped with calculated precision, each syllable carefully chosen to paint herself as the dignified widow. But beneath the perfectly coiffed exterior and designer mourning clothes, investigators sensed something darker. They just couldn't prove it. Yet. As detectives dug deeper into the case, interesting details began to emerge. A week before the murder, Barbara and her lawyer, Manuel Martinez, had flown to Puerto Rico. There, they borrowed $100,000, the exact amount prosecutors would later claim was used to pay for the hit. The killer's description was frustratingly vague, a man in a bright green baseball cap and plaid shirt. He'd acted with the cool professionalism of someone who'd done this before, calmly walking away from the scene as if he hadn't just gunned down a man in broad daylight. Witnesses described him tucking the revolver into his waistband and disappearing into the city, leaving behind only 3 spent .44 caliber shell casings and a grieving young woman holding her dying lover. The weapon was never found. But perhaps most telling was Barbara's behavior in the hours and days following the murder. While George fought for his life in the hospital, she didn't rush to his bedside. Instead, she remained at the salon, more concerned with her appearance than her dying husband. When asked about this later, her response was chilling in its casualness. She claimed she was too distraught to go to the hospital. For nearly 2 decades, it seemed like Barbara Cogan had executed the perfect crime. She collected the life insurance money and moved to Puerto Rico, living the high life while investigators struggled to build a case against her. Even when she filed for bankruptcy in 1998, having burned through much of the insurance money, she remained free. But perfect crimes, like perfect marriages, often have hidden flaws. And as the new millennium dawned, those flaws would begin to show. The web the Black Widow had so carefully woven was about to unravel, thread by deadly thread. Because what Barbara didn't know was that her trusted confidant, Manuel Martinez, had left a trail. And somewhere in the shadows, a hitman with a green baseball cap was waiting to be found. The question wasn't if Barbara Cogan would face justice, it was when. For years, the case of George Cogan's murder gathered dust in the NYPD's cold case files. But like many perfect crimes, it wasn't quite perfect enough. The first thread in Barbara's carefully woven web began to unravel in 1996, when several witnesses finally came forward with information about Manuel Martinez, Barbara's lawyer during the divorce. The witnesses painted a disturbing picture. They claimed Martinez wasn't just Barbara's divorce attorney. He was her connection to the criminal underworld. But by the time investigators tried to question him, Martinez had vanished. Like a ghost, he'd slipped away to Mexico, leaving behind a trail of questions and setting off an international manhunt that would span more than a decade. Martinez's disappearance was no coincidence, said Assistant District Attorney Joel Seidemann, who had pursued the case from its start. He knew we were closing in, and he ran. But sometimes, running only delays the inevitable. While in Mexico, Martinez couldn't stay out of trouble. In a twist of fate that investigators could hardly believe, he managed to get himself arrested for defrauding a Mexican bank of $1.2 million. He was sentenced to 11 years in a Mexican prison, and suddenly, the man who might hold the key to George Kogan's murder was behind bars, just not the right bars. For years, U.S. authorities worked to extradite Martinez. Meanwhile, back in New York, Barbara Kogan continued living off what remained of her dead husband's money. But her lifestyle was catching up with her. Despite collecting $4.3 million in life insurance, she filed for bankruptcy in 1998. The Black Widow's web was starting to show signs of wear. The real breakthrough came in 2008. After serving his time in Mexico, Martinez was finally extradited to New York. What happened next would shake the foundations of Barbara's carefully constructed alibi. During Martinez's trial, witnesses testified that he had received a chilling phone call right after George's murder. The caller reportedly said just 2 words: "It's done." Phone records showed the call came from a man named Paul Prosano, also known as Tony Pro, a name that would become central to the investigation. Prosecutors believed Prosano was the triggerman, the mysterious man in the green baseball cap. But Prosano, who was serving 25 years for an unrelated kidnapping, denied any involvement. In a 1998 interview with the New York Post, he claimed his only connection to Martinez was as an exterminator. "I was his exterminator," Prosano insisted, though investigators found this explanation less than convincing. The evidence against Martinez mounted quickly. Prosecutors had recordings linking him to the hit, and multiple witnesses testified about his role in arranging George's murder. But the biggest bombshell was yet to come. During Martinez's trial, evidence emerged that Barbara had been more than just an innocent widow. The prosecution revealed that she and Martinez had flown to Puerto Rico specifically to arrange the hit. They had borrowed $100,000, the exact price of the contract killing. The timing of her call to the insurance company, just a week before the murder, suddenly looked far more sinister. Martinez was convicted in 2008, receiving 25 years to life for his role in the murder. But the real target was still free. Barbara Kogan, the Black Widow herself, had managed to avoid arrest for nearly 2 decades. That was about to change. In 2008, just months after Martinez's conviction, investigators finally had enough evidence to move on Barbara. She was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and grand larceny. The woman who had spent years living off her dead husband's money while maintaining her innocence was finally facing justice. But Barbara wasn't going down without a fight. For 2 years, she maintained her innocence, insisting she had nothing to do with her husband's death. She might have continued this stance indefinitely, if not for one crucial mistake: she couldn't keep quiet. While in jail awaiting trial, Barbara made several phone calls to a friend. What she didn't realize was that these calls were being recorded. On these tapes, she made incriminating remarks that would prove to be her undoing. The Black Widow had finally tangled herself in her own web. In 2010, faced with the damning evidence of her own recorded conversations, Barbara Kogan finally cracked. After maintaining her innocence for 20 years, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, conspiracy, and grand larceny. The facade she'd maintained for so long finally crumbled. But even in her guilty plea, Barbara showed little remorse. Her lawyer, Barry Levin, attempted to paint a picture of a troubled woman, revealing that she had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had been hospitalized repeatedly, including 3 times in the previous 5 years. "I don't say this to excuse this crime," Levin told the Manhattan court, "but I bring that out because I don't think that Barbara Kogan had or has the capability today to think through all of her actions." The sentencing hearing was a study in contrasts. Barbara Kogan, now 67, sat stoically in her signature black designer outfit as Mary Louise Hawkins's impact statement was read to the court. The words were devastating. The real irony is that in having George killed, Barbara Cogan lost the one person who understood that she was in need of special care, and who tried all their married life to indulge her material desires and keep her safe, Hawkins wrote. When given the chance to speak, Barbara offered no explanation, no apology. Her silence spoke volumes. The judge sentenced her to 12 to 36 years in prison. The Black Widow's web had finally collapsed completely. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this case was its impact on the Cogan family. Scott Cogan, one of Barbara and George's sons, spoke at his mother's sentencing. His words revealed the deep wounds that 20 years of suspicion and denial had inflicted. For nearly 20 years I have suppressed strong thoughts of suspicion, anxiously focusing elsewhere, Scott said, his voice heavy with emotion. But even in this dark moment, he found room for hope, adding, "May the day soon come when Barbara Susan Siegel Cogan is welcomed as a different person." The case of Barbara Cogan serves as a chilling reminder of how greed and jealousy can destroy lives. But it also demonstrates that no matter how carefully a web of deception is woven, truth has a way of emerging. In July 2020, after serving just 12 years of her sentence, Barbara Cogan was granted parole. During her parole hearing, she attempted to rewrite history once again, claiming she had never planned to collect the life insurance money and expressing surprise at her husband's death. "Actually, when he was murdered, I was so astounded," she told the parole board, seemingly forgetting her guilty plea from a decade earlier. The statement was vintage Barbara Cogan, manipulative to the end. When news of her impending release reached Mary Louise Hawkins, her response was bitter, but unsurprised. "She's an animal," Hawkins told reporters. "Barbara is extremely good at manipulating people, even parole officers." By November 2020, Barbara Cogan was a free woman, required only to check in with her parole officer in Manhattan. The Black Widow had served her time, but the web of destruction she'd woven would continue to affect lives for years to come. On a crisp November morning in 2020, Barbara Cogan walked out of Taconic Correctional Facility, a free woman. Gone were the designer black outfits that earned her the Black Widow nickname. Instead, she emerged looking every bit her 77 years. A far cry from the sophisticated socialite who once commanded attention in Manhattan's elite circles. Within 24 hours of her release, she was back in Manhattan, not for a luxury salon appointment this time, but to meet with her parole officer. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered how she'd chosen a hair appointment over being with her dying husband 30 years earlier. The decision to grant Barbara parole sparked immediate controversy. During her parole hearing, her behavior raised eyebrows among those familiar with the case. When asked about her role in her husband's murder, her response was tellingly dismissive. "I feel horrible, okay?" But it was her next statement that truly revealed how little had changed. "Actually, when he was murdered, I was so astounded," she claimed, seemingly forgetting her guilty plea from 2010. The calculated manipulation that had served her for decades was still evident in every word. Even more shocking was the parole board's response. One member actually congratulated Barbara on her strength and endurance, citing her participation in treatment programs and volunteer counseling work. It was a moment that left many questioning the justice system's ability to see through the Black Widow's continuing manipulations. Mary Louise Hawkins, the woman who held George Cogan as he died on that Upper East Side sidewalk, was devastated by the parole decision. Now in her late 50s, she has never fully recovered from the trauma of that October morning. "She's an animal," Hawkins told reporters after learning of Barbara's release. "Barbara is extremely good at manipulating people, even parole officers. Her biggest concern wasn't for herself, but for Barbara's sons. My main goal was to make sure she stays away from her sons because she will coerce them and try to get them to feel sorry for her. They've been through enough." While Barbara Cogan and Manuel Martinez both served time for their roles in George's murder, some questions remain unanswered. The hitman, believed to be Paul Tony Pro Prosano, was never charged with George's murder. Though serving time for unrelated crimes, he maintains his only connection to Martinez was as his exterminator. The murder weapon was never found. The man in the green baseball cap who calmly walked away from the scene remains officially unidentified. These loose ends continue to haunt investigators who worked the case. The case of Barbara Cogan changed how law enforcement approaches contract killings. The 2-decade gap between George's murder and Barbara's conviction highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining witness relationships over extended periods. It also demonstrated how financial records, like Barbara's suspicious insurance inquiry, could help build a circumstantial case. This case taught us that time can be both an enemy and an ally, says prosecutor Joel Seidemann, who pursued the case from its beginning. While witnesses' memories fade, guilt often becomes harder to carry. People talk, relationships change, and eventually the truth finds its way out. The financial cost of Barbara's crime proved staggering. The $4.3 million insurance payout she collected, roughly $8.5 million in today's money, was gone within 8 years, leading to her 1998 bankruptcy. The $100,000 paid for the hit, money borrowed in Puerto Rico, bought her 20 years of freedom, but ultimately led to her downfall. But the human cost was immeasurable. 2 sons lost their father to murder and their mother to prison. A young woman was traumatized for life. The Cogan family name, once associated with wealth and success, became synonymous with one of New York's most notorious contract killings. Since her 2020 release, Barbara Cogan has maintained a low profile, a stark contrast to her previous life of luxury. Under parole supervision until 2038, she must report regularly to her parole officer in Manhattan. The woman who once spent $500 on a hair appointment while her husband died now lives a much humbler existence. The Upper East Side where George Cogan was gunned down has changed little. The spot where he fell, groceries scattered around him, is now marked only by the memories of those who remember that October morning in 1990. Mary Louise Hawkins never returned to the apartment building where she and George had planned to build a life together. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Barbara Cogan's story is how ordinary it began. A talented young singer, a prestigious college education, a seemingly perfect marriage. Nothing predicted the devastating turn her life would take. Her transformation from socialite to Black Widow serves as a dark reminder of how greed and jealousy can corrupt even the most privileged lives. The story of Barbara Cogan is more than just another true crime tale. It's a cautionary story about the destructive power of greed, the patience of justice, and the long shadow that violence casts over generations. While Barbara may have regained her freedom, the web she wove has forever altered countless lives. Now let's move on to our next case. Let's dive in. They say the perfect crime doesn't exist. But in 2011, a French aristocrat seemingly achieved the impossible, making his entire family disappear without a trace. Well, almost. What investigators found buried beneath the family's garden patio would shake France to its core, launching one of the country's most infamous manhunts. But here's the thing that makes this case so chilling. The perpetrator didn't just vanish into thin air. He left a trail of breadcrumbs, carefully orchestrated letters, and a web of lies so intricate that it still has investigators scratching their heads over a decade later. Was this the work of a calculating killer, or something far more complex? Before we dig into the disturbing details of this case, let me introduce you to the family at the center of this dark mystery. The Dupont de Ligonnès weren't just any French family. They were aristocrats, descendants of a noble lineage stretching back generations. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, born on January 9, 1961, carried himself with the confident air of old money. But like many noble families in modern times, the reality behind the facade was far less glamorous. Xavier married Agnès Hodanger in the 1990s, a deeply religious woman who worked as a teaching assistant at a Catholic school. Together, they created what appeared to be the perfect family: 4 children, Arthur, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit. From the outside looking in, they seemed to have it all: a comfortable home in Nantes, private school education for the kids, and the prestige of an aristocratic name. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. Xavier's business ventures were failing one after another. He created companies with vague purposes, hired employees only to fire them shortly after, and seemed to be constantly chasing the next big break that never came. By 2011, the family's financial situation was dire, though they maintained appearances with remarkable precision. The children, though, were thriving despite their father's financial troubles. Arthur, the eldest at 21, was studying IT and working part-time at a pizzeria. Thomas, 18, was pursuing his passion for music at university. Anne, 16, was described by friends as kind and deeply religious like her mother. And Benoit, the youngest at 13, served as an altar boy at their local church. But in early April 2011, something changed. The family began acting strangely, though no one could quite put their finger on what was wrong. Then, piece by piece, they started dismantling their lives in Nantes. The first red flags appeared when Arthur didn't show up to collect his wages at the pizzeria, something completely out of character for the responsible young man. Then Anne and Benoit stopped attending school, with vague explanations about illness. Their mother, Agnès, suddenly stopped showing up for work, with a series of increasingly bizarre excuses being made on her behalf. But it was what happened next that truly set alarm bells ringing. A note appeared on their mailbox. Return all mail to sender. Thank you. The family's bank accounts were systematically closed. The lease on their house was terminated. It was as if they were methodically erasing their existence. Then came the letters. The children's schools received notice that the family was moving to Australia. Agnès' employer received a resignation letter claiming the same. But the most bizarre communication came in the form of a letter to Xavier's immediate family, claiming something that seemed straight out of a Hollywood thriller, that he was a U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration operative, and the entire family was being relocated under witness protection. By April 13, 2011, neighbors became concerned enough to contact the police. The house's shutters had been closed for over a week, unusual for the family, and Agnès' car hadn't moved from its spot on the street. But what police would discover when they finally entered the property would turn this missing persons case into something far more sinister. When investigators began searching the property, they noticed something odd about the recently laid patio in the backyard. Beneath those fresh concrete slabs, they made a discovery that would shock the nation. 5 bodies carefully wrapped and buried along with the family's 2 Labradors. The victims were Agnès and all 4 children, each killed with chilling precision. But Xavier was nowhere to be found. The autopsies revealed a horrifying truth. Each victim had been drugged and shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle while they slept. The weapon used was the same type Xavier had inherited from his father just months before. But the methodical nature of the crime suggested this was no impulsive act. This was carefully planned and executed with cold precision. As police pieced together the timeline of events, they discovered something chilling. Xavier hadn't simply vanished after the murders. Instead, he embarked on what investigators would later call his farewell tour across France, a methodically planned journey that seemed designed to confuse and misdirect anyone trying to follow his trail. On April 11th, just days before the bodies were discovered, Xavier checked into the premier-class hotel in Blagnac, near Toulouse. He paid by credit card, not exactly the behavior of someone trying to hide. The next night, he moved to the Auberge de Cassagne in Le Pontet, this time using the alias Mr. Laurent Xavier. Again, he left an electronic trail, paying €214.59 for his stay. But here's where things get interesting. On April 13th, Xavier made contact with an old girlfriend from the 1980s in La Seine-sur-Mer. They didn't meet, but the call suggested he was saying goodbye to his past. The next day, surveillance cameras captured him at a Formula One hotel in Roquebrune-sur-Argent, the last confirmed sighting of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. This final image shows him walking calmly through the hotel, carrying what appears to be a rifle case. The next morning, he checked out, abandoned his Citroën C5 in the parking lot, and seemingly vanished into thin air. But Xavier didn't just leave behind a car. He left a trail of carefully crafted letters that raised more questions than answers. Remember that letter about witness protection? Let's dig deeper into what he wrote. According to the letter, Xavier claimed he was working covertly for the DEA and the entire family needed to relocate to America under federal protection. He even advised relatives to spread rumors about them moving to Australia as a cover story. The level of detail was remarkable, but was it the work of a man trying to protect his family, or a killer creating an elaborate alibi? The problem? The DEA had no record of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. Not as an informant, not as an agent, not in any capacity. Yet the letter wasn't the ramblings of a madman. It was carefully composed, methodically planned, just like everything else in this case. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Xavier had been preparing for months. In March 2011, he purchased rifle bullets and registered at a shooting range. He visited 4 times between March 26th and April 1st, often bringing his sons Thomas and Benoit to learn to shoot. Was this a father bonding with his boys, or something more sinister? Then there were the supplies: cement, a shovel, lime, and large garbage bags, all purchased from different stores to avoid suspicion. Xavier even bought a box of adhesive plastic paving slabs, the same type used to cover the makeshift grave in his garden. But perhaps most disturbing were the witness accounts that didn't quite fit the timeline. Multiple people claimed to have seen Agnes alive days after police believe she was killed. A neighbor insisted she spoke with her on April 7th. A saleswoman friend said she saw her in her shop on April 7th or 8th. These sightings raised an unsettling question. Could some family members have still been alive, perhaps held captive, while Xavier executed his plan? The case gripped France, spawning countless theories and turning ordinary citizens into amateur detectives. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some believed Xavier had indeed fled to America, perhaps with help from criminal organizations. Others were convinced he had taken his own life in the vast wilderness near where his car was found. The investigation led police down numerous paths. They searched monasteries, believing Xavier might have sought refuge in religious seclusion. They investigated possible sightings across Europe, Africa, and South America. Each lead seemed promising, only to end in disappointment. Then, in 2015, a journalist received something strange: a photograph of Arthur and Benoit sitting at their kitchen table. On the back was written 2 simple words: "I'm still alive." Was this a cruel joke, or had Xavier broken his silence? The hunt intensified. Police received over 1,000 tips, but none led to Xavier. Even when monks at a monastery in Roquebrune-sur-Argent reported seeing someone resembling him, it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. In 2019, 8 years after the murders, the case exploded back into headlines. Police at Glasgow Airport detained a man they believed to be Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. Initial fingerprint comparisons seemed promising, and French media erupted with reports that the long manhunt was finally over. But within 24 hours, the excitement turned to embarrassment. DNA tests confirmed the man was not Xavier, but rather a Portuguese-born French citizen traveling to visit his wife in Scotland. The incident highlighted just how desperate authorities were to solve this case, and how elusive Xavier remained. After more than a decade of dead ends and false leads, 3 main theories have emerged about what really happened to Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. Each one seems plausible, yet each has its problems. Let's break them down. The first theory is what we might call the perfect escape. Supporters of this idea point to Xavier's meticulous planning. Remember those shooting range visits? The carefully staged letters? The systematic closing of accounts? This wasn't a man acting on impulse. This was someone executing a carefully crafted plan. Financial records show Xavier had been creating shell companies for years. He had experience with international business and understood how to move money discreetly. Some investigators believe he could have squirreled away funds in offshore accounts, preparing for his eventual disappearance. But here's where it gets interesting. Xavier's sister Christine has consistently maintained his innocence. In fact, she believes the entire family might still be alive, protected by witness protection as Xavier claimed in his letter. While this might sound far-fetched, she points to some compelling inconsistencies in the official investigation. According to Christine, the autopsy reports contained troubling discrepancies. The body's heights and weights didn't match known measurements of family members. More bizarrely, some witnesses claimed to have seen Agnes alive days after her supposed death. Even the children's physical descriptions in the report seemed confused, with details about the two sons mixed up. Then there's the practical matter of the burial site. The space under the patio was only 1.2 meters high. That's just under 4 feet. How did one man manage to dig out over 2.5 cubic meters of earth, move 5 bodies, and perfectly reconstruct the patio, all while working in such a confined space? And where did all that displaced soil go? No trace was ever found in the garden. The second major theory suggests that Xavier, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, took his own life after the murders. Supporters point to the area where he was last seen, the rugged terrain of the Var region. It's the perfect place to disappear if someone wanted to end their life without being found. The fact that Xavier made a point of contacting old friends and visiting familiar places before vanishing could be seen as a farewell tour. He even reached out to an ex-girlfriend from his youth, the kind of action someone might take when putting their affairs in order. But if Xavier did take his own life, where's his body? The area has been searched extensively multiple times, including by cave diving experts who explored 40 natural caves within a 15-kilometer radius of where his car was found. Nothing was ever discovered. The third theory is perhaps the most intriguing, that Xavier's claims about the DEA weren't entirely false. While he wasn't working for them, some investigators believe he might have been involved with criminal organizations. Remember that company he created in Florida, NetSurf Concept LLC? His advisor there specialized in helping clients open anonymous bank accounts and obtain untraceable bank cards. Was this just business planning or preparation for a future disappearance? The location where Xavier vanished, near the French Riviera, offers easy access to Italy, Spain, and North Africa. With the right connections and enough money, someone could disappear into any number of countries where French authorities would have trouble tracking them. In recent years, the case has taken some surprising turns. In 2015, after that mysterious photo was sent to a journalist with the message, "I'm still alive," authorities launched a new wave of investigations. While they couldn't authenticate the message, it sparked renewed interest in the case. The French police still maintain an active file on Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. He remains one of France's most wanted fugitives, and his case has become something of an obsession for both law enforcement and the public. Every few years, a new sighting or theory emerges, reigniting interest in this baffling mystery. So what really happened to Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès? Did he pull off the perfect escape, ending up on some distant shore with a new identity? Did he take his own life in the wilderness, his remains still waiting to be discovered? Or is there an even darker truth we haven't yet uncovered? The answer might lie in the very perfection of his disappearance. As one investigator put it, the problem with Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès is that he looks like everybody else. He's of average height, average build, with no distinguishing features. There's nothing worse for a manhunt than someone who looks perfectly normal. Perhaps that's why this case continues to captivate people more than a decade later. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès didn't just kill his family. He created one of the most perfect disappearing acts in criminal history. Finally, we arrive at our last case. Let's dive in. They say the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. And in the glittering world of 1950s New York high society, no shadow loomed larger than the one cast by Ann Woodward, the showgirl who shot her way into the elite and then shot her way into infamy. On a dark October night in 1955, 2 shotgun blasts shattered the silence of a luxurious Long Island mansion. When the echoes faded, William Woodward Jr., heir to a banking fortune, lay dead at the hands of his own wife. She claimed it was a tragic accident, that she had mistaken him for a prowler. But in the whispered conversations of Manhattan's elite, a far more sinister story took shape. Was this really a terrible mistake by a frightened woman? Or was it something far more calculated, a desperate act by a social climber who would do anything to maintain her grip on wealth and status? The answer would take decades to emerge, and when it did, it would claim not just one life, but 3. So grab a seat at society's most exclusive table, because we're about to unravel one of the most scandalous stories ever to rock New York's upper crust. This is the tragic tale of Anne Woodward, the chorus girl who danced her way into high society, and the loaded shotgun that brought it all crashing down. Before she was Anne Woodward, before she was Mrs. Bang Bang, she was just Angeline Lucille Crowell, a farm girl from Pittsburgh, Kansas. Born December 12, 1915, to a streetcar conductor father and a schoolteacher mother. No one could have predicted that this Midwestern girl would one day become one of New York's most notorious socialites. But Angeline had bigger dreams than Kansas could hold. After her parents' divorce, she reinvented herself as Anne Eden, a fresh name for a fresh start. In 1937, with nothing but ambition in her suitcase, she boarded a train to New York City. The Great Depression was waning, and the city that never sleeps was starting to dance again. Anne quickly proved she had more than just good looks. She signed with the prestigious John Robert Powers modeling agency and landed roles as a radio actress. By 1940, she had been crowned the most beautiful girl in radio. But it was her job as a showgirl at the ritzy Fifi's Monte Carlo nightclub that would change her life forever. It was there she caught the eye of William Woodward Sr., chairman of the Central Hanover Bank and Trust, and one of New York's wealthiest men. But it wasn't the father who would ultimately claim her hand. It was his son, William Billy Woodward Jr., who fell hard for the beautiful showgirl. The marriage in 1943 shocked New York society. Here was Billy Woodward, Harvard graduate, Navy officer, and heir to one of America's great fortunes, marrying a chorus girl from Kansas. His mother, the formidable Elsie Woodward, was horrified. But Anne had achieved what countless other ambitious young women only dreamed of. She had married into the upper echelons of society. Soon, Anne was living a life that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. She and Billy owned a magnificent townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a sprawling estate on Long Island's Gold Coast, and a horse farm in Maryland. They bred and raced thoroughbreds, attended the most exclusive parties, and traveled the world. They had 2 sons, William III and James. From the outside, it looked perfect. But behind the glittering facade, cracks were starting to show. The marriage was troubled from the start. Both Anne and Billy engaged in affairs, and their fights became legendary in social circles. One night at El Morocco, Anne scratched Billy's face until it bled after finding lipstick on his handkerchief. In 1947, Billy asked for a divorce, but Anne refused to let go of her hard-won position in society. Then came that fateful autumn of 1955. The Woodwards' neighborhood in Oyster Bay had been plagued by a series of burglaries. On October 30th, after attending a dinner party honoring the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Anne and Billy returned home. Both were nervous about the burglar reports. They went to their separate bedrooms, each taking a loaded shotgun for protection. What happened next would become one of the most talked about events in New York society history. According to Anne, she heard noises in the middle of the night. Grabbing her shotgun, she ventured into the dark hallway. She saw a shadowy figure and fired twice. When she turned on the lights, she found her husband's naked body lying in a pool of blood. The police arrived to find Anne sobbing inconsolably in her bedroom. The investigation began, but questions immediately started swirling. Why had she fired twice? Why didn't she turn on the lights first? And why was Billy naked in the hallway at that hour? But this was just the beginning of a story that would span decades, destroy a family, and expose the dark underbelly of New York's social elite. A story that would eventually catch the attention of one of America's most famous authors, Truman Capote, and lead to not 1 death but 4. The Nassau County Grand Jury would eventually rule the shooting an accident, especially after police arrested a man named Paul Worths, who admitted to attempting to break into the Woodwards' house that very night. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was far from settled. Anne Woodward might have been cleared legally, but in the drawing rooms and private clubs of New York, whispers of Mrs. Bang Bang continued to circulate. She tried to maintain her place in society, but the doors that had once welcomed her began to close. Even those who publicly supported her, like her mother-in-law Elsie, privately harbored their doubts. Anne found herself increasingly isolated, a pariah in the world she had fought so hard to enter. But if Ann Woodward thought her troubles would fade with time, she was tragically mistaken. Enter Truman Capote, the literary darling of New York society, and a man with an appetite for scandal that matched his talent for prose. Capote had made himself the confidant of New York's elite women, whom he called his swans. These wealthy, beautiful socialites trusted him with their deepest secrets, never suspecting that their pet writer was actually a snake in their midst, taking careful mental notes of every scandal and indiscretion. And Ann Woodward? She was exactly the kind of story Capote couldn't resist. A chorus girl who shot her way into society and then shot her way into infamy. It was too delicious to ignore. Though he had only met her once briefly at the Palace Hotel in St. Moritz, Capote became obsessed with her story. As one society friend recalled in a later interview, Truman was like a heat-seeking missile when it came to scandal. And Ann Woodward? She was the biggest scandal of them all. He wouldn't let it go. He kept asking questions, collecting gossip, piecing together his own version of what happened that night. What made Capote's fascination with Ann particularly cruel was that he had already decided she was guilty. In his telling, there was no question about it. Ann Woodward had murdered her. Husband in cold blood. Never mind the grand jury's ruling, never mind the confirmed burglar in the area. Capote had his story, and he was sticking to it. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Capote worked on what he claimed would be his masterpiece, a novel called Answered Prayers. It would be, he promised, a literary atom bomb dropped on the very heart of New York society. And at its center would be the story of Ann Woodward, thinly disguised but unmistakable to anyone who knew her. Meanwhile, Ann tried to rebuild her life. She threw herself into philanthropy, supporting causes like the World Wildlife Foundation and the Museum of Modern Art. She traveled extensively in Europe, trying to escape the whispers that followed her in New York. But she could never quite outrun her past. Her sons, William III and James, grew up in the shadow of their father's death. They attended the finest schools, inherited trust funds, and carried the weight of the Woodward name. But they also carried something else. The terrible burden of never knowing for certain what happened that night in 1955. Then, in 1975, Capote made his move. He published an excerpt from Answered Prayers in Esquire magazine titled La Côte Basque, 1965. In it, he created a character named Ann Hopkins, a malicious Betty Grable who seduced and then murdered her wealthy husband. The details left no doubt about who he was writing about. Capote wrote with savage precision. She was clever with David. She knew she'd hooked a biggie, even if he was only a kid, so she quit what she was doing and got a job in lingerie at Saks. She never pressed for anything, refused any gift fancier than a handbag, and all the while he was in the service she wrote him every day. But it was his description of the murder that was most devastating. Through his character Lady Ina Coolberth, he wrote, "Surely it was then she decided to kill him, a decision made by her genes, the inescapable white trash slut inside her, even though she knew the Hopkinses would arrange a respectful divorce and provide a very good allowance." The impact of Capote's story was immediate and devastating. Though he had used pseudonyms, everyone in New York society knew exactly who he was writing about. The article was set to appear in the November 1975 issue of Esquire, but advance copies were already circulating in October. On October 10, 1975, Ann Woodward was found dead in her Fifth Avenue apartment. She had taken a massive dose of cyanide. By her bed was a note that simply asked the reader to remember Ann Woodward. She was 59 years old. When told of Ann's death, Capote showed little remorse. But the tragedy wasn't over. The ripples from that fatal night in 1955 would continue to spread, claiming more victims. In 1978, Jimmy Woodward, Ann's younger son, jumped to his death from a window of his mother's former apartment. Then, in 1999, William Woodward III also died by suicide, jumping from his apartment building. 3 generations of Woodwards, destroyed by one night in 1955, one shotgun blast in the dark, and one writer's relentless pursuit of what he believed to be the truth. They say time reveals all truths, but in the case of Ann Woodward, time has only deepened the mystery. Nearly 70 years after those fatal gunshots rang out in Oyster Bay, we're still left wondering, was it truly an accident? Or was it the calculated act of a woman desperate to maintain her position in society? What we do know is this. The story of Ann Woodward reveals something darker about the society that both embraced and rejected her. As one socialite later reflected, the tragedy wasn't just that night in 1955. The real tragedy was how quickly society turned on one of their own. They had accepted her when she was Billy's beautiful wife, but the moment scandal hit, they couldn't distance themselves fast enough. The irony of Ann Woodward's story is that in trying to maintain her place in high society, she instead became its cautionary tale. Her life reads like a reverse Cinderella story, the farm girl who became a princess only to lose everything in a blast of gunsmoke. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is how it was shaped by Truman Capote. Fresh off the success of In Cold Blood, Capote saw in Ann Woodward another chance to blur the lines between fact and fiction, between journalism and literature. But this time his subject wasn't a convicted killer in Kansas. It was a woman who had been legally cleared of any wrongdoing. Capote's obsession with Ann Woodward reveals something about the nature of storytelling itself. As he crafted his version of events for Answered Prayers, he wasn't just writing about a crime, he was playing judge, jury, and executioner in the court of public opinion. In one of his last interviews before his own death, Capote defended his actions. "I'm a writer. I write what I believe to be true. If people can't handle the truth, that's their problem, not mine." But whose truth was he really telling? The investigation had cleared Ann. A burglar had confessed to being in the area that night. Yet Capote, who had met Ann only once, claimed to know what really happened in that dark hallway. The aftermath of this tragedy extended far beyond Ann's death. Her sons, William III and James, never escaped the shadow of that fatal night. Growing up, they faced whispers and sidelong glances. Were they the children of a murderer? Or were they the sons of a woman who made a terrible, tragic mistake? Their deaths, both by suicide, both by jumping from buildings, added yet another dark chapter to the Woodward saga. As one family friend later said, "Those boys were casualties of that night just as surely as their father was. They just took longer to fall." The Woodward case continues to fascinate us because it touches on universal themes: ambition, class, betrayal, and the thin line between accident and intent. It raises uncomfortable questions about society's treatment of outsiders, about the power of the press, and about the nature of truth itself. Today, the Woodward mansion in Oyster Bay still stands, though it has long since passed to new owners. The house where Ann Woodward spent her final years on Fifth Avenue has been renovated and sold many times over. But the ghost of this story still haunts New York society. In the end, perhaps the most telling epitaph for Ann Woodward comes from her mother-in-law, Elsie Woodward. After Ann's suicide, Elsie, who had publicly supported her daughter-in-law for 20 years while privately doubting her, said simply, "She shot my son and Truman just murdered her, and so now I suppose we don't have to worry about that anymore." But we do still worry about it. We worry about the power of words to destroy lives. We worry about the cruelty of society's judgment, and we worry about the truth, how easily it can be shaped, distorted, and lost to time. So what do you think? Was Ann Woodward a calculating murderer who got away with it? Or was she a victim, first of a tragic accident, and then of a society that turned its back on her? Was Truman Capote right to tell her story the way he did, or did his pursuit of literary fame cross an ethical line? Remember Ann Woodward's final wish, to be remembered. But perhaps the real question is, how should we remember her? As a murderer, a victim, or something more complex? A woman caught between worlds, destroyed by the very society she fought so hard to join. Until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and remember, sometimes the most shocking crimes happen in the most elegant places. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to explore more stories about society, scandal, and the price of ambition, make sure to subscribe to our channel.